Hello and welcome to everybody who's joining us today. My name is Rubina Ahmed Haq, and I'm going to be moderating today's panel talking about innovation during COVID-19 for entrepreneurs, for small businesses, and how things have been just changing so dramatically during this pretty tumultuous time. We know that communities are continuing to adapt to the current pandemic conditions. We know that entrepreneurs and those who are creative and knowledge workers continue to work from home. And that's really meant learning new skills, learning to do things in a different way, learning to do things with children at home, which is the case for me, really having to adjust my timings because I can't work 9 to 5 anymore. I really do have to think about other people, not just myself, because there is no child support. In this Munk School Innovation Policy Lab, we are going to be joined by 4 experts. I want to introduce them to you now. Our first expert is Tara Vendudrai. She's an associate professor and director of the Master of Urban Innovation program at the Institute for Management and Innovation at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Welcome. Next is David Wolf. He is the co-director, Innovation Policy Lab, Professor Political Science, University of Toronto, Mississauga. Welcome to you. Ben Spiegel, he's a senior lecturer in entrepreneurship and director of entrepreneurship and innovation at the University of Edinburgh Business School. Welcome to you. And Catherine Baudry is the Canada Research Chair in Creation, Development, and Commercialization of Innovation and professor in the Department of Mathematical and Industrial Engineering at Polytechnique Montreal. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to open it up and we can start whoever wants to jump in, just by saying, this has been a really unique time. COVID-19 has shaken the way that all of us work, especially those who are entrepreneurs. What have you been most surprised about 4 months later about the way things have changed? We can start with David.
I think the thing that surprised me the most is that companies that were in the digital space, particularly in digital enabled, I've been impressed and surprised at how fast many of them have adapted. Everybody was using digital technologies to some extent, but the pace at which they've upped the game has been quite impressive. The number of online reports where consulting firms and others have said that things that they were expecting to take 2 to 3 years in terms of digital adoption and diffusion were happening in 2 to 3 months. The other thing we've seen is quite a few companies saying very publicly they are never going back to the way they did things before, and that will extend to include working from home, working virtually, using collaborative tools. It's going to affect the use of physical space in downtown cores. It has, I think, some implications for the agglomeration of firms in the downtown cores if everybody's not going into those big towers where they normally work. But the other thing I've been impressed with is in cities and regions that had strong existing clusters of firms and cluster organizations. The cluster organizations have adapted really quickly and really effectively as well. And they've shifted their activities online. They're continuing to support their members and promote the growth of the firms in their clusters and cluster organizations. So the question I keep asking myself, Rubina, is what would this all have looked like if it had happened in 2000? Mm-hmm. How would we have managed to deal with a pandemic like this if we were dealing with the state of digital technology and the internet circa 2000 or even earlier? So I think, it's hard to look for silver linings in the midst of all of this, but that's one small one that I find.
We can look back to 2000 and September 11th when we were all at home for a very short period of time, but how we did feel so disconnected for that period of time because all we really did have was very simple technology compared to what we have today, where there wasn't things like Zoom and video conferencing. So not that we can use that as an example of what's happened as a comparison to today, but there was a time, where the world did stop 20 years ago, but just not for 4 months. Tara, I wanted to ask you, what have you been most surprised about, especially when it comes to, maybe the possibility of people no longer having to live close to the urban center. I've heard a lot of even friends talking about how now they're thinking about moving up north and buying a small piece of land because they know they can do their job remotely. That's an actual possibility because of what's been happening during the pandemic.
Right. So I would actually like to echo something that David said, and it really builds on this sort of question about, how remote can work actually be. And work is very uneven in terms of what kinds of facilities or resources or infrastructure you need. So I think we need to be really careful about parsing that out. There's the scientist who requires a lab, and those are very physical and embedded spaces. A manufacturing worker who might be very innovative requires infrastructure around that, but digital work can ostensibly be done anywhere, but that's not very true. If you start to look at things like the access to broadband, and a lot of scholars who look at rural development would point very quickly to that as a real physical barrier to remote work and the quality of that connection. But I think there's something much more fundamental that I've been really surprised at. On the one hand, absolutely, there's been some very adept and swift pivots, if you want to call them that, both in sectors like manufacturing. We've seen manufacturers switch very quickly from for example, we were doing a project where we're seeing manufacturers switch from making craft gins to hand sanitizers, and very quickly trying to produce the equipment needed to sort of address the health risks around the pandemic. But there's another big question about how quickly we're rejecting the office and office spaces. And innovation itself is a very social process. And yes, there are absolutely some tools that are substitutable. Certainly, I think a number of us who work in those ways are really becoming fatigued by things like Zoom. But there's the unexpected interactions that come with not to romanticize the discussion around the water cooler, or the accidental bumping in a conversation that leads to either a great idea about how to solve a particular technical problem. But those things might be lost if we don't think and step carefully. And so that's, I think, for me, the biggest surprise is the knee-jerk reaction to rejecting the office outright and quickly.
I've always sort of seen this period as a honeymoon period. Like, we don't really know what this is going to look like, years from now. I mean, it's great to be able to do it from 4 to 6, maybe a few more months longer than that. But 18 months, 2 years, are we going to be fatigued with being at home? And like you said,
right,
and not having those sort of organic conversations where, hey, I was thinking about this, and then sort of swapping ideas that you would have to actually physically pick up a phone or email someone to make that happen, and it just wouldn't feel as natural.
Right, and it's also about the network piece around that, right? People develop networks, and depending on the industry that you might be working in or the kind of work you do, those networks are very fundamental to finding the next project, the next piece of work that you're going to do. We talk about the gig economy, and often we talk about Uber drivers and those kinds of things. But there's a lot of people who work in creative work and in other work that's highly innovative and highly creative, but it requires those networks, and they're very difficult to build if you're just sitting at home. And I think previous research on networks would often indicate that that's going to amplify a number of inequities, and I think we're already seeing that. In terms of who's being included or excluded in those networks, women especially right now, who tend to be taking the brunt of the childcare responsibilities, as the systems are sort of out of place for the time being, hopefully not too much longer. But those kinds of inequities might actually be amplified. So I'm very concerned about this sort of romanticization of the work from home situation as it relates to innovation.
Especially for young people, because that's when you're building your network in your 20s, and then that network carries you throughout your entire career. If you don't have that time, I mean, imagine starting your first job in your pajamas at home. It just doesn't
right.
have that same, remember when we were young and we were, trying to make our way up the corporate ladder kind of feeling. Ben, I wanted to ask you, what have you been most surprised about during COVID-19 in your space?
Yeah, so the context that I have is I'm, in Scotland, and I'm running a research project looking at the impact of COVID on high growth firms here in Britain. And so again, I'm seeing similar issues that Tara and David just said with. For instance, there's a lot of talk of never going back to the office because it saves a whole lot of money, especially for firms in London. But there's also a big concern over what happens to new employees. How do you actually join a company and join a community and a corporate culture if, as you said, you're sort of sitting at home in your pajamas? So that there's a lot of question marks there, and a lot of concerns. But what surprised me the most is actually the amount of business model innovation we've seen just in the past 4 months. So, for example, there may or may not be a really loud buzz in my apartment in the next hour, and that is going to be a grocery delivery. And it's not coming from the major chains; it's coming from a caterer who knew they were getting no work for the next 6 months, and they pivoted quickly to food delivery, using their supply chains, using their contacts to provide a new service. And frankly, for me at least, one that's better. Within the high tech domain, we've been seeing that too. Of the companies I've spoken to, a lot of them have noticed a fallow period. So times when they have less pressure to onboard customers, to sort of work, to solve, sort of daily problems. And they could refocus resources from marketing, from sales to product innovation. But there's also been a time for their customers to rethink their strategic goals. And again, they're all looking now for cost savings. They're all looking for new ways of working, and that creates new opportunities for entrepreneurs. So what I'm seeing is that you have lots of alert entrepreneurs suffering, obviously losing sales, losing revenues, but at the same time seeing new opportunities that they can react to much faster than larger corporates. And so that, if there is a silver lining for me, that's going to be one of the major silver linings, is that as much as this destroys opportunities, this crisis, it's going to create a host of new opportunities. And as long as there's the infrastructure to support those entrepreneurs, so investment, R&D support, the broader ecosystem community, that does have the potential to spur a lot of entrepreneurial potential that creates jobs, creates wealth, creates sort of social value, potentially that wouldn't have been there before. But obviously, the wave of negative effects is going to be much, much higher, at least over these initial months and potentially even years.
Catherine, I wanted to ask you, what has been most surprising in your work during COVID-19, even your own personal experience of sort of having to change the way that we work every day?
Yeah, well, I'll discuss the international framework that my colleagues haven't touched yet. I mean, we, as a moment, we have an obsession with optimizing everything. AI has been there to optimize everything. Yet in the COVID, what we've seen is basically a collapse of some of the supply chains. Some plane full of masks were no longer coming to Canada. They have been, literally hijacked and going to another country. Some countries imposed some restrictions on what could be exported in terms of medical equipment, in terms of pharmaceuticals, in ingredients for important drugs to treat people suffering from COVID. But at the same time, we have seen, as Tara mentioned, the manufacturing industry just basically turned around and produced a whole bunch of medical equipment. A fantastic example is CAE in Quebec, which makes flight simulators. Just basically in 11 days turned around and produced a ventilator for hospitals. So we've seen, this is what I call, the Dunkirk or Apollo 13 moment. I mean, when you needed the innovators and the creators, they were there to find the solution. So for me, the surprising moment was seeing, the supply chain collapse, the countries closing on themselves, yet the innovation and the movement and the reaction to help was overwhelming, and that raises a whole bunch of questions of, how do you certify or regulate a ventilator that comes from a company that is not used to work in the health industry, for example. So for me, that was really surprising. And this caused a discussion on, do we need to produce everything in-house in Canada? Or what's going to happen if we don't maintain the supply chain open, or we don't play the international game? And that has repercussions that are quite interesting in terms of capacity of producing everything that we need just in case. So we've just added a layer of plan B, C, D, E, F that needs to be planned for just in case. So I will, I'll probably stop that, because, Tara said, most of the things I would have said about the network, and the thing that we need to actually come together every once in a while to innovate. So I think maybe I'll leave that to another question. And, by the way, I have the wrong ears for these earbuds, so they keep falling out. So they're too small, I guess. The ears, not the earbuds. So another thing that we've found surprising, and that will echo what Tara was saying, in terms of academic work, what we've noticed is that men have increased their productivity during COVID, whereas women have decreased their productivity. They're submitting less grants, they're submitting less papers, because basically the whole burden of the house had just landed on their shoulder, and all the, the kids. I mean, so that's an important aspect to consider about, working from home and not going to the office. I'm sure that a lot of women will want to run straight to the office as soon as it opens.
Thank you, Catherine, for that. I say landed on my head rather than my shoulders. Just feels like everything's just piling on. I want to thank everybody who has joined the webinar today to talk about innovations while we are managing this pandemic. There are a number of ways that you can ask questions to our panelists. You can ask them in the Zoom platform. You can ask, it's already built in. There's a Q&A feature, so please send your questions that way. You can also ask us through Twitter. Just make sure you hashtag it Munk Talks, MUNKTALKS. And you can also email us if you have a question and you want to submit it that way to events.munk@utoronto.ca. And so we will be taking all of your questions, and our panelists will be answering them as we go along from now until the noon hour here in Toronto, at least. I wanted to see if we have a question that we can ask. Otherwise, we can continue this discussion. So we don't have any questions yet from. Oh, no, I think we do actually have a couple. Yes, David.
Rubina, I just want to make one other point, building on what the other panelists have said. Catherine brought in the international dimension. But I think there's a relative dimension that's really important here in terms of relations between clusters of firms and innovation ecosystems. I think one of the things that COVID is going to do is it's going to accentuate a very strong trend that's been underway for some time. The largest, the most dynamic clusters have been pulling away from the rest, from other parts of individual countries and other parts of the world. And I think because firms and individuals are going to lose the ability to network that Tara talked about, it's not going to be as easy to network and interact. Those clusters of firms, particularly in large dynamic cities that already had well-established relationships and have been able to move those relationships online, I think they are going to continue to pull ahead. And I think we're going to see a further segregation between the dynamic leading edge places, the ones that our colleague Richard Forda calls the spiky places, and other parts of the world that another colleague of ours in London refers to as the places left behind, or the places that don't matter anymore. And that's going to have very dramatic implications, both in terms of economic development, innovation ecosystems, but also, as we've seen, it has really dramatic political implications, because the places being left behind, the ones that feel they're not participating in economic growth and development, are the ones that have the strongest political reactions to those trends. So I think that's, governments are always faced with the challenge of balancing economic development across more advanced and lagging regions. And I think COVID is going to dramatically accentuate that division, that geographic division as well, and add a whole other dimension of complexity that governments are going to have to deal with.
The first question we're getting here, and it has been touched on already, is internet access. They're asking, hasn't the CRTC made it virtually sorry, it's worded a bit funny. Hasn't the CRTC made it so that all Canadian citizens and businesses can have decent internet access by the end of the year? I've heard different announcements. I know there's definitely a focus on trying to, especially in remote communities, even before the pandemic started, calling internet, always saying it's a utility. It's no longer a luxury. Can anyone weigh in if they've heard anything that they're going to be moving forward with, so that entrepreneurs can continue to work remotely if they have to with good internet access?
So the Liberal government had introduced a program in 2015, 2016 to bring expanded broadband access to rural and remote areas of Canada. It had been rolling out really slowly. There is actually a website on Innovation, Science, Economic Development Canada that you can go to check what the access is for your local area if you put in your postal code. In 2019, the government announced they were accelerating that program, but they're still talking about 2023 before it's fully rolled out. So in 1997, 1999, Canada was one of the leaders globally in bringing broadband access to remote areas, rural and remote areas, and we've fallen dramatically behind in 20 years. So we're playing catch up. When you compare us to countries like Korea that are world leaders in this area, we lag seriously behind.
The second question we're getting is, can anybody on the panel offer any of the innovations that are happening, that are emerging right now? Perhaps specifically they're speaking to this time during this pandemic, new ideas that have come out specifically because the pandemic started and people saw that there was a need to innovate and to help businesses.
Well, I can answer. I have a few ideas on this that I've been discussing. One of the aspects that is important with the pandemic is that basically the public transport has been vacated. Nobody wants to take the metro, nobody wants to take the subway, the train, or anything. So what people are discussing in terms of innovation in that matter is basically mobility as a service versus campus or office as a service. So you no longer need to go to your main office downtown. You could have an app like, the Google Map, or for example, to say, there's a scheduled meeting with David, Tara, and I, assuming we live in the same town, of course. And that meeting is scheduled for 10 o'clock. And the app says, it's a bit crowded in the subway for Tara to get to that place. So I've basically rerouted you to another office that's at the other end of town. And immediately you have the cell phone of David and I, who would just say, okay, you've been rerouted in that. You take not this metro, but you take this subway station and this bus, and that's going to take you to the other metro station. So mobility and office as a service could be integrated and collectively bring you to another place than where you would normally meet, in order to avoid crowded and have a better spread of the transportation during during COVID or whatever other diseases we might have later on. I mean, we don't know how long we're going to be stuck in that. So this is something that is being discussed. The move towards everything as a service. So I think it's called XaaS, for X for everything and as a service. So this is something that we're seeing and being discussed. So I'll leave my other colleagues to add examples.
So I think for me, the most interesting innovations we've seen so far aren't necessarily technological, but organizational. So again, just seeing the new ways that people are coming together to solve collective problems and discuss it. So again, we've seen just within my field of entrepreneurial ecosystems, people trying to move meetups online, quickly realizing that the webinar is not the best style. And quickly again trying to iterate new approaches, so more chat roulette style where you're quickly matched up one-to-one with someone for 5 minutes to try to replicate the actually important aspect of a meetup or seminar, which wasn't the stage on the stage, but it was the talking with the people over drinks, getting to know people you didn't know before. So really quickly innovating new ways of organizing, of building connections, and again of sharing information. What I've been seeing so far is that the most important source of support for entrepreneurs right now isn't email lists coming up from a government source or sort of information agency telling them what they can apply for. It's the WhatsApp and Slack groups where they could just talk to each other, say what's going on, say I've heard this, or I've heard this program isn't worth applying for, or this is garbage. Sharing that knowledge, again trying to not replicate their pre sort of pandemic experience, but try to distill the parts of it that were most important, and push those into an online or virtual forum where they can take advantage of that as far as they can.
Yeah, Tara, sorry.
No, I was just going to add. I mean, I think it's again about what do we consider to be an innovation, right? I mean, there's this sort of the idea of new products, and it might be not new products for in the marketplace in general, but per a comment that Ben made very early on about sort of the pivot of a caterer that shifts to food delivery. It's new products to the firms themselves, right? So we've seen a lot of that where the firms themselves are doing things that are absolutely new to them, even if they're not new in the marketplace. So I think there's a lot of innovation in that way that we need to think about and account for, because in some cases that is going to open up new markets and potential new opportunities in places where they didn't exist before. So I think that's certainly one of the things to be thinking about. And the other thing is a lot of adoption of more rapid adoption anyway of new technologies, particularly in the software realm, as everyone is rushing to figure out the platforms they can or cannot use to facilitate work at distance. And again, I do think we need to be careful to parse out, and when we're thinking about where innovation happens and the kinds of innovation that happens is very sensitive to industry, right? And so I think we tend to, when we think about this, we tend to think a lot about sort of the digital space and software and the talent behind that. But if in reality, there's a much broader spectrum of work and industrial activity happening, and what constitutes innovation is going to be quite different depending on that context. I think David wanted to add something.
Yeah, well, speaking of areas with dramatic changes in innovation, no one's talked about the healthcare sector and the drug discovery process, and I think that's been hugely impacted by COVID. Processes of exploring for vaccines, which again would normally take 2 and 3 years, everyone is saying is going to happen in the next 6 months. There are normally, to get a drug into clinical trials, you go through stage 1, 2, 3 before you get the full-blown trial, and that process is being accelerated. But I think, to speak to a point that Catherine made before, we're seeing tremendous application of AI technologies in the drug research and the drug discovery process, and things that would take months or years in a clinical lab can be done much more quickly online and virtually using AI techniques. So I think that's also been a huge hotbed. The pandemic's been a huge hotbed to promote more rapid development innovation in that field. Where I think we've lagged and where the pandemic has really revealed shortcomings is in the area of public health. We tend not to think about and treat the public health system as part of the regular innovation ecosystem. But in fact, what the pandemic has made clear is that in many respects, our public health system is probably the front line of defense against these kinds of diseases. Finding a vaccine is what you do after, everybody, gets infected. But those countries that got the pandemic under control the most quickly were the ones that had the most flexible and adaptable public health systems that could use, that could link up. Some Asian countries were able to link up their immigration databases with their public health record systems and trace people very efficiently through them. Other countries, particularly North American ones, just don't have that capacity and weren't able to do so. And of course, in Canada, we're limited because we have 10 systems of public health records and one national system for immigration data. And, to link them all together would be a mammoth undertaking. So I think,
David, I think I will disagree there.
Okay, by all means.
I think our public health system is really not that bad. For example, we already have the capacity to trace anybody who arrives with TB in a plane is tested immediately. Everyone that was around this person. This is an international network that can trace certain diseases when they travel. So we already have the capacity to trace people already for TB or for Ebola or for I can't remember the list of diseases, but the disease that require a declaration, the information climbs up to the public health in Canada. So we just need to add another disease to that list, and so I'll leave you to continue, but I think we're not that bad.
Very unevenly, Catherine. If you talk to people who've flown into Pearson Airport in Toronto and ask them, how they were interviewed and what tracing followed up their arrival, it's very lax. It's not nearly as rigorous as was done in some of the Asian countries, Korea, Singapore, that really were much more advanced. And I was thinking particularly of our neighbor to the south, where many people have commented that what the pandemic has done is shown how the underinvestment in public health systems has really taken a toll on their ability to respond. So the point I would just want to make was that I think the pandemic is going to expand our notions of what the innovation ecosystem involves in the health sector, not just from new drug discovery, vaccines, testing equipment, but also to broader public health systems. And there's enormous potential to employ digital technologies in the public health system to make it work more effectively.
That's actually good that David, you brought up the US and Canada, because the next question is about that. Catherine, you had suggested, this question asked, that we have had to focus more on domestic issues during COVID, especially how they affect women and how all of a sudden, we're doing our full-time job and doing all those things that we're now more responsible for doing at home. They ask, does the ultra-nationalism emerging in the US and elsewhere mean that we'll need to build strong domestic production infrastructure? Or does the gap created by US nationalism mean that Canada can become a more important global player? I think the question they're trying to ask is, can we emerge because the US and all the issues that they are having with COVID-19, can we sort of benefit from that by emerging as being much more organized in the way that we manage COVID-19, and on top of it, talk about domestic issues that I believe they're asking affect women more than they do men.
There's two issues here. There's the issue about the burden of the housework, the kids, the homeschooling that a lot have had to do. There's been, the mention in the chat about the Statistics Canada recovery, saying that men were employed or recovered their jobs much faster. What you have to bear in mind, a lot of women didn't lose their job. Employed as nurses, they were in hospitals, they were they were employed as primary and secondary school teachers, so they didn't lose their job, so they didn't have to recover. You have to be careful when you look at the statistics, which looks only at recovery. And I'm sorry, my internet is telling me that it's unstable, so you might lose me. The question about Canada being a global player, I think that any economy that will completely close its borders and maintain the drugs and the equipment inside and not share the innovation and say the vaccine's going to be for us will lose their position as global players. I think the global players will emerge as those that collaborate and maintain these channels of collaboration. And one thing that we do very well in Canada, I mean, we're fantastic in science and technology. I mean, we're in the top of the world in this. We just need a bit more organization, and this is what Ben was speaking to earlier. It's the organizational innovation that will need to be developed. And David was talking to this about accelerating the drug discovery, testing, approval, regulation. I mean, at the moment, what we had before in terms of regulation for drugs was a bit like a snake and ladder game. So basically the ladders were the innovation and the snakes were the regulation. So you build all the clinical phases, you arrive with something that you think is going to solve the problem, and then suddenly regulation says, no, you have this. So you go back to square one and then have to start again. So if we are to improve or have business process innovation in the drug business, is basically to co-develop the regulatory system as new drugs or new medical equipments, which combine different sorts of knowledge from various sources, which are not part of the standard list of technologies or materials that are approved. So that creates a lot of slowdown or delays in the process. So I think a lot of business process innovation will be required in order to function well as an economy. And I think we have the ingredients in Canada to be at the forefront of that by maintaining the collaboration. So I'm sure my colleagues.
Yeah, just to add on what Catherine was saying, I don't necessarily think it's a matter of nationalism. I think that what this crisis has shown is that global supply chains are great when things are great and not fantastic when things are bad. And so there's going to be a big movement towards realizing that textiles are a strategic industry now to produce PPE. That reagent production is a strategic industry in order to produce tests. And so there's going to be, I think, a reassessment of what can be globalized and what there needs to be a local capacity for. And this probably doesn't mean that we're going to have N95 mask factories mothballed until they're needed, but there's going to be a much bigger push for flexible production. For, again, gin distilleries to join the fight and produce hand sanitizer within 24 hours. For textile plants or pulp fat plants to be able to produce the materials needed for the next stage of production. So I think, again, there's going to be a lot of push for innovation there and shifting business there. Not necessarily that every country needs a giant PPE industry, but that they work with manufacturers so that production processes can be quickly shifted on a very quick basis to produce what's needed for the next pandemic, or hopefully we're thinking a bit broader, to be able to just react quickly to many different types of crises as they come.
Ben, I wanted to ask you, if you are a gin distillery or producer and all of a sudden you're making hand sanitizers, I mean, I'm just thinking from my own perspective, to get to that point where I would open a distillery to make gin, I've got to be really passionate about it. How long can they make hand sanitizers and still feel passionate about what they're doing? Because they didn't get into the business to make hand sanitizers. I wonder how that affects innovation.
Yeah, so there's an irony here. So one of our latest Scottish unicorn billion-dollar company is BrewDog, which I'm not going to lie makes awful beer. They're just not good at their job. But whatever, that's not my main area of research. But they quickly shifted to hand sanitizer, and then they realized that hospitals actually want things certified, and they want to make sure that things are made right and that things are usable. And glass bottles aren't a very good way to be distributing hand sanitizer. And so I kind of think that a lot of that initial shift over of distilleries and things like that, weren't bad, but they were much less useful than we think. And so again, there's this concern is that if you want to have a dual purpose gin distillery / hand sanitizer factory, that's going to require a lot of extra investment that a gin distiller entrepreneur probably can't afford. And that's where you need that public support in deciding where the priorities lie. Is this an opportunity to build resiliency into the production system, or is this going to be a waste of public money if we never need this hand sanitizer? That's where the difficult decisions lie.
Yeah, I'm assuming that Lysol and all these other companies had to go through many tests before they were allowed to put their products on the shelves and sell them to consumers. I mean, it's not just as simple as switching a couple of things over. One question towards David. This question is that you touched on that we've seen data on smaller firms being hit the hardest in Canada. I think that's true globally. The small firms are the ones that are mostly suffering, small businesses. Do you think the potential for accelerated spiky growth might apply at a firm level as well? And might we see more winner takes all dynamics? So I think they're really speaking to are the big companies going to come in and just be the successful ones?
So that was the point I was trying to make, is that I think the pandemic is accelerating winner take all dynamics. I was making the point about it on a geographic scale, but it clearly applies on a firm by firm basis. I think, we've seen it in Canada. The company that I've just been fascinated by over the last 3 or 4 months is Shopify. It was already on a strong trajectory, but it's exploded. I think it may now be the largest company by stock market valuation in Canada, bigger than Royal Bank, which is quite incredible when you think about it. And they just announced a new program with the Ontario government yesterday, where Ontario is going to support them in rolling out their digital services and technologies to thousands of new small businesses to help them go online and digitize more effectively. So I think that's a classic example of a winner take all dynamic. But it does open up lots of opportunities for small, nimble, innovative companies who can move into the space quite efficiently. But I think it's going to be a question of how effectively they can take advantage of the market opportunity, the kind that Ben was talking about a few minutes ago. Can I go back, Rubina, to the question about Canada-US and the rise of nationalism? I think there's another geopolitical dimension to this that we haven't touched on. We know that clusters and innovation ecosystems do not exist in isolation, but they're part of a much larger global innovation ecosystem. And what we see going on, I think that's people have been slow to catch on it. I think we're in the middle of a global geopolitical reordering. China has clearly been on the rise as an important part of all these global innovation networks. The global supply chains that people were talking about a few minutes ago, a lot of them have been tied into sources of production in China and some research in China. And I think for a whole variety of reasons, which are way beyond the topic of this panel, some of those networks and relationships are being reordered right now. I think the potential big winner geopolitically to come out of this may be India. We're already seeing evidence of a shifting of large technology companies taking activities out of China and moving them to India. And if there's an opportunity for Canada and for innovation ecosystems in Canada that I think we would need to move very, very nimbly to take advantage of, it's to build, we have tremendous relationships through our diaspora communities with India and the rest of South Asia. I think if that geopolitical reordering is underway, then I think it gives us tremendous opportunity through our various innovation ecosystems across the country to build on those linkages and networks we have to South Asian companies and innovators and take advantage of that geopolitical repositioning that I think is underway. So that would be, if I was sitting in Ottawa at Global Affairs Canada, or I said, thinking about how we strategize coming out of the pandemic, that would be one development I'd be wanting to pay very close attention to.
Is that more because of India's focus on technology? And, we know that there are so many technology companies based there because we're still a consumer culture, and China is one of the biggest providers of that, being able to satisfy our appetite to constantly consume. Can India step in and take over that kind of role?
I think they potentially can. Not in every area. Like India is not Shenzhen, so they don't have the tremendous production capability. But a lot of that production capabilities have been moving out of Shenzhen into other parts of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines. So that shift has already been underway. But I think the research and development and the software development can move to India much more easily. And we know already that in the innovation sphere, there's been a tremendous shift over the last decade of hardware functionality into software. And I think that gives India a competitive advantage. We are very strong in software development in Canada as well. So that means that we potentially have, we can build those global innovation networks more effectively with India. I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm saying I see it as a potential opening that we could possibly take advantage of.
So this next question is about global production chains. They're asking, do you think that firms will continue to adapt to these new innovations? I think they're really thinking, is this just during the pandemic where everyone is being forced to pivot and change? Or do you think this is going to last after the pandemic ends, especially considering global production chains? Like, are we going to go back to the old way, or are we just innovating right now because we have to?
I mean, I think very little innovation is planned out carefully and strategically. I think most innovation is reacting to changes. If that change is, again, central bank policy changing that makes the dollar strong and exporting better or worse. If that change is a political shift in China that allows factories to go, you're always reacting to what's going on versus having full control of the situation. So some things will definitely, some of the things we're seeing right now will definitely continue. We don't know what, because we don't know how society is going to be changing. Maybe we're all terrified of going back to the office and there will be total massive shifts of downtown. Or maybe a year from now, things are better and we realize how unproductive remote working is and there's a rush back to the city. That's hard to predict. But what I think we will see is, like I said, governments love closing doors after the cows have escaped, or closing the barn door after the cars have escaped. So there'll be a massive push towards public health, towards relocalizing production chains, which will have long-term consequences for the importance of global networks, or at least the ability to produce important strategic things locally. But again, the bill for that is going to be expensive, and it'll be interesting to see government's willingness to pay out for those long-term shifts in our production capacity after they paid out so much in order just to keep the economy going, huge immediate investments in healthcare. So we just need to see what this is, what the final toll is, and government's willingness to pay one more time for that change.
One audience member is asking how the quality of research is affected because we are not going into the office, we're not collaborating, we have less access to technology and labs. Maybe in some cases you are still able to go and work in a lab somewhere, but not at the rate that we were before the pandemic started. How will that affect the quality of work that's coming out, regardless of what sector you work in?
I think it will affect maybe the quantity of work, probably not the quality, because as I mentioned earlier, I think Canada is a very, very strong producer of science and technology. The capacity is there. I think the universities are developing the means by which we can go back to the lab safely. And there's a movement to use the time capacity of the lab space a lot more efficiently. So there's a lot of I would call, business process innovation or organizational innovation to make sure that we use the full capacity of the lab. I wanted to come back to the previous answer you had about, there's a question about the new Green Deal. And in the environmental circles, there's been a lot of push towards the green recovery. And I think that maybe the environmental or advocates or whatever you want to call them. Sorry, the word in English eludes me at the moment. But I think the pandemic is offering them the trigger that is needed to realize that the kind of tsunami wave of climate change that is behind this small pandemic that has stopped the entire planet, basically, or the economic system of the entire planet. This made us realize, and maybe this is the trigger for the population to realize, that we really need to get prepared and organize our economy, our resilience, to make sure that when this tsunami wave hit, I mean, metaphorically, it's probably not going to be a tsunami, but we're ready, and we can survive, and we can continue to function. So I think that a lot of the discussion about Green New Deal, the green recovery, or they're there, and they should be taken seriously, and they should be taken into consideration when we talk about innovation. We can talk about sustainable innovation, the whole movement about Society 5.0 needs to be taken into consideration. All the 17 the UN are slowly making their way into the innovation sphere, and so there's progress in this regard. So, but that answered your previous question. So I'll leave my comment to.
So we have about 8 or 9 minutes left before we end the webinar. This is a final question for all the panelists. You've all together made a case for being optimistic when it comes to coping. The reactions that the audience has seen so far has been that things are going to get better. If we were to get together in 6 months, do you think that we will be right? Do you think that we are going to be better, or are we missing something that we're not seeing 6 months down the road?
I'm happy to jump in, because I think that there's a mixed case here. I don't think it's a fully optimistic case. And I think if I sort of reflect back on what I've said, I think it's highly uneven. There's unquestionably been lots of things that are new and highly innovative, but there are real questions about, coming back to the comment David made about sort of, the winner takes all economy. That suggests winners and losers and places being left behind. And also in the places that are in the winning situation, there are people being left behind too. And I think some of these shifts, whether they be shifts to remote work or just, the slow recovery, better in some places and less in others, without really strong institutions, and particularly strong social institutions, and sort of innovation in the social sphere, to think about the underpinning institutions that are allowing all of this to happen. And kind of comes back to the comments that Catherine made about gender equality, systems of school and childcare, all of which are currently very stalled, at least where I'm sitting in Toronto, but I think and in a lot of other places too. I think there's a case for a mixed prognosis here, one where there's unquestionably some really, really fascinating and encouraging signs, but some that are actually, much in the same way that pandemic is revealing some of the really great strengths. I think it's also revealing some of the greater weaknesses and inequalities that exist, and actually amplifying those as well.
Ben, I see you nodding your head. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I again completely agree with Tar, and I think when we're talking in public, there is this desire to say optimistic, find really emphasize the silver linings, but this is going to be a really bad time for a lot of people. A lot of people are going to be left behind. And again, Tara and Catherine brought up the issue of gender, but we also need to talk about the issue of age. There are a lot of students going through high school and university who, despite the best efforts of their teachers and their lovable professors, will not have the same quality education as their peers 2 or 3 years ago. And that will have knock-on effects for decades to come. There is some amazing research coming out of Brazil after a change in that looked at the impact after a change in admission standards, where universities brought on more students who weren't as well prepared as the others. And so even though they have the same degrees from the same institutions, those students who were less prepared going in had large negative impact on their employment years and years and years after they graduated. And so the knock-on effects from education are going to be gigantic, and we have not yet begun to reckon with them. And that, I think, will be, outside of whatever health impacts there are, going to be the largest scar from what's going on. And again, innovation will help in this. We will get better at remote teaching. I'm going to be better in September than I was in March. But it's still going to be a long haul to get the education system up to where it used to be if we're teaching remotely or hybrid for more than a year or so.
Even to give you my own personal example, we moved recently so that we could be in a school district where the French immersion program was really good. And now we're hearing today that the children may not have access to French immersion next year. And so my daughter's only going in to her second year of being immersed in French. So would she be able to catch up after having a year off, even, considering she's not really had much French education since March, since my husband and I don't speak French. So I hear what you're saying. We moved here so that she could be bilingual, and I don't know whether that's going to be a reality. David, did you want to say something about, 6 months from now, what are we going to look back and say?
I want to build on what Kathy said. I think it's not going to be universally positive coming out of it. I think there are serious challenges, but building on what Catherine said a little while ago, I think how we recover from the pandemic is going to be really dependent on how well we integrate that recovery process with a number of broader trends that are underway. One is the trend to a greener economy through the process of decarbonization, which we were already dealing with. I think the pandemic is going to accelerate it and impact different parts of the economy differently. The public transit system has been really badly hit. How do we reorganize public transit? Do we shift to mobility as a service, as Catherine was talking about? That's a huge challenge. I said digitization, the pandemic has dramatically accentuated the need for companies and services to digitize. They will do that unevenly. So how we recover will depend on how effectively we diffuse those digital technologies. But I think, ultimately, I'm going to come back to public health because it's not an area I've done research on before, but I've been really struck by it through the pandemic. All the virologists and epidemiologists say this is not the big pandemic. That one is still coming. Whether it comes in 5 years, whether it comes in 10 years, there is another, worse pandemic than this one coming. And the question, and we've seen lots of accounts of how we didn't learn the lessons from SARS and MERS and the other earlier ones to really get our public health systems in shape. And if we don't draw the correct lessons from this pandemic and prepare for the next one, then I will be very pessimistic. That's the pessimistic note. I think we have the capacity to learn. Whether we do it or not depends on our collective ability to take advantage of what we've gone through.
Just to add on what
yes.
David said, when I hear or read in newspapers that our hospitals are only just digitalizing their stocks, that means that before the pandemic, we had no idea how many masks, how many visières we had. There's no knowledge about what was really needed. So the acceleration of the digital transformation of hospitals and the health system being integrated with public health, these can't be two silos. These needs to be much, much more integrated. I think that's going to be the lesson. And I hope that in 6 months, everything will have been digitalized so that we know where we stand at a higher level.
Okay, this has been a great conversation. I first want to thank everybody for allowing me to be your moderator. Thank the Munk School for inviting me to do this. This is something out of my normal day-to-day stuff, so it's been really interesting and fun and being able to connect with everybody. Thank you to Ben Spiegel, to Atara Vinudra. Oh gosh, I'm never going to get it right. Vino Dry, David Wolf, and Catherine Beaudry. I believe this is going to be captured on video and be available later. So if anybody wants to watch it again, my name is Rubina Ahmed Haq. If you want to talk to me, you can reach me on Twitter at alwayssavemoney. That kind of gives you an idea of all the things that I'm all about. Thanks so much, guys, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you
Great.
for hosting.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting.